Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
And we are
the FAIRtax Guys.
And we are on vacation this week. Christmas holiday coming up, wishing everybody a very Merry Christmas. So we're going to dig back in the vault and come up with one of our all-time favorite FAIRtax Power Radio episodes, the Jefferson skit.
Yep, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah,
this is a skit that was written by Steve Hayes and Charles Adams. And, hey, wait a minute. I got an idea.
What?
Instead of us talking about what Steve was thinking when he wrote this, why don't we ask Steve himself?
Oh, okay. Well, I can arrange that. Here, hang on. And we've got Steve Hayes on the phone here. Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Thank you again for talking to us, buddy.
Ron and Bobby, it's a real pleasure to be with you, as always.
Okay, well, FAIRtax Guys are going to be taking a little time off for the Christmas holidays. We're going to be replaying one of my all-time favorites from the FAIRtax Power Radio Grooveyard back here, the Jefferson skit, which was based, the radio play was based on an article that you wrote originally. And I just kind of wanted to get into your head and get the backstory of how all that happened to come about.
Well, I was working with my good friend Charles Adams, who's passed away, but Charles wrote a book called For Good and Evil, where he went over the history of taxation, and he and I appeared on several different forums together and became quite good friends. And we were talking about the fact that Thomas Jefferson, in one of his writings, one of the things he boasted about at the end of his presidency, and I'm paraphrasing now, but that the average person would have to go miles and miles before he could ever see a federal tax collector or interact with one because they were not in his or her life. And that hit me as something very telling because that's the model that the founders intended. They intended us as free people to be free of that kind of government intervention. And so that's how the article came about. I proposed it. I said, Charles, I'm going to write a draft. I want you to look at it. And so I can't say that it was strictly my article because Charles certainly contributed, but that's how it originated. We said, what would Thomas Jefferson think today when he looked at this ghastly system that we have with all of the vultures in the swamp, playing around and taking money out of your and my pockets for their own benefit, by creating these incredible obfuscating things that they think that we're going to continue to fall for. And up to now, Bob, we have. Unfortunately, we've let them get away with it.
Unfortunately, you're dead right. I'm
sorry?
I said, unfortunately, you're dead right.
Well, I am. I think, though, that their time to do this is running out. It's like, in my chairman's report this week, I compare the use of the big lie, which actually in 20th century came from Mein Kampf, from Hitler, when he wrote Mein Kampf.
Yes.
And the problem with the big lie is it only works until people start quitting trying to understand what must be true about it and say, wait a minute, it's just a lie. That happened to Hitler. His people turned against him from 43, 44 onwards. And that's happened to anyone promoting the big lie. And I really predict, Bob, it's going to happen in D.C. It's going to happen with the swamp because right now there's a revolution going on with people evading the system, $9 trillion over the next decade. I think it's going to be higher than that. But that's what was predicted by Dr. Sabula using IRS numbers, not other numbers.
All right. Well, we sure appreciate all your efforts that you have done to try to get rid of the swamp, drain the swamp, get rid of the income tax, replace it with a fair tax. So let me wish you a very Merry Christmas, my friend, and we will go in and start listening to this Jefferson skit based on your article. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob.
Our story begins on the evening of April 13th, 2015. Meet George Morgan, a typical American husband and father. George works hard to provide for his family. His job as a commercial pilot with a large airline affords him a comfortable, though hardly a lavish lifestyle. He's just finishing dinner when there's a knock at the door.
Who could that be? We're not expecting company tonight.
George strides quickly across the room and opens the door. Standing there is a tall, slender man with longish red hair wearing what looks like some kind of costume. The stranger has on a long blue coat over a white vest and white pants, black shoes, and a large brass belt buckle. He reminded George of the characters in the John Adams special he'd just seen on HBO. For a moment, George considers slamming the door and calling the police, but something about the man's relaxed, confident manner stops him.
May I help you?
Hello, I'm Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson? Really? Is this some kind of joke?
No, sir, it's no joke. I'm really Thomas Jefferson. May I come in, sir?
Hesitating briefly, George's mind runs back to a picture he remembers from his 10th grade history book.
He does somewhat resemble Thomas Jefferson. This must be a joke, an impersonator, somebody hired to mess with me. But, let's see, that was Charlie Gunn. He knows I'm a history buff. Okay, I'll play along. This might be good for a laugh or two. Thomas Jefferson, huh?
Yes, sir.
Well, come on in. My name is George Morgan.
It's nice to meet you, George.
One question. Just how did you get here? This is the year 2015, you know.
Well, it's a long story, but basically I was granted the opportunity to come back and check on our blessed republic. We knew that we were embarking on a marvelous experiment with our fledgling nation. No other nation in the history of the world was ever founded on the principles that we all so passionately believed in. We hoped we were building something solid, something that would survive for centuries to come. I'll always remember what Dr. Franklin said right after the Constitutional Convention. Someone asked him what form of government was being proposed. His answer was, a republic, if you can keep it. Many warned us throughout history, as governments become more powerful, the people will gradually give up their freedom. The great Frenchman Alex de Tocqueville may have said it best. Society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people until each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. We were so determined to prove him wrong. We were determined to build a nation that valued liberty and individual freedom above all else, a place where government served the people, not the other way around. It's been a dream of mine for more than 2 centuries to come back and see how well it's all held up over time.
Hey, you're pretty good. You've almost got me convinced that you were actually there back then.
Sir, I was there. This is not a joke. I am Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, okay, if you say so. Well, we're still here, but I think you're going to find that de Tocqueville was a lot closer to being right than you might want to believe. It's a very different country today than it was in the beginning.
Indeed. Things do look a lot different. It's rather amazing that I haven't seen one single horse here. How do you people get around?
We have cars now, motorized vehicles that run on gasoline, much faster and more reliable than horses. Most families have at least 2. But if you really want to see something amazing, I'll take you out to the airport and show you a jet airplane.
A jet airplane?
Yes, it's a flying machine.
A flying machine? You mean people can actually fly now?
Oh, yeah. Airplanes have actually been around for over 100 years now. But today's modern jets, like the ones I fly, can carry several hundred people and fly at about 600 miles an hour. You can get from Boston to Paris, France, in about 7 hours today.
7 hours? In 1784, that trip took me an entire month.
Well, you'll find that we've made a lot of progress in 200 years.
George and Thomas continue their conversation about all the technological progress that's been made over the past 2 centuries.
Thomas is amazed to learn about telephones, television, refrigerators, microwave ovens, computers, electric lighting, and air conditioning. But soon, his attention is drawn to a pile of papers on George's dining room table. There were all kinds of strange and complicated-looking forms there with funny names like 1040, W-2, 1099, Schedule D, and a host of others.
What is all of this, if I may ask, sir?
That's my income tax. It's due in 2 days, and it's a real pain in the, well, you know.
Income tax? Who collects an income tax? A few states wanted us to have a federal income tax, but we all knew that that was a horrible idea. All of us knew that an income tax was the tax of tyrants. It would allow the government to intrude on the basic rights of free men. That's why a direct tax was expressly forbidden in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution.
Well, today most states and the federal government all collect an income tax. The federal tax code today is over 77,000 pages long. It's an incredibly complicated process. No one can possibly understand it all. Certainly not the average taxpayer, that's for sure. But it's something every American has to deal with. The way it works is that I have to fill out all these forms telling the government how much money I earned last year and where it all came from. There's a lot of other stuff they need to know too, but when I get it all figured out, I know how much tax I owe. The way they have this set up, the more money I make, the higher my tax rate.
Thomas stares at George in disbelief.
Where did all this come from? That's certainly not what we had in mind for our republic.
Well, of course, they tried to make it easier. My employer has to estimate my tax liability for the year, deduct money from my paycheck every month, and then send that into the government. That's called withholding. If the money withheld from my paycheck meets my tax liability, I don't have to pay anything more. But if it's short, I have to pay the difference by April 15th. If they actually withhold too much, I get a refund, but I still have to fill out all this paperwork to see where I stand with the government. Now, a lot of this paperwork is me trying to reduce my taxable income by taking deductions. I tell them how much I give to my church and other charities, how much interest I pay on my home mortgage, how much I pay for child care and medical expenses, things like that. I also get an exemption for every child, so I tell them how many children I have. Of course, I have to keep pretty detailed records to support the deductions I take, but it does help reduce my taxes. So it's worth the effort, I guess. But you know, a lot of people find all this just too much to deal with, and they pay someone else to do it for them. If you know what you're doing, there's a pretty good living to be made helping other people with their taxes. But I really try to do my own. The real crazy part is that the government already knows how much money I make. My employer, my stockbroker, my bank, anyone I earn money from has to report how much they paid me to the IRS. And then I have to turn around and do it all again on this tax return. I guess they just don't trust me to honestly report my income. It's really an insane system.
It is an insane system. Are you serious? You not only have to report to the government how much money you make, but you have to tell them how much you gave to your church, how much you spend for medical care, and how many children you have? That is none of their business. Now, what is this IRS of which you speak, sir?
The Internal Revenue Service. It's this huge federal agency that costs about $10 billion a year to operate. They administer the income tax, and you sure don't want to get on their bad side. They have the right to audit your tax return, and they can go back several years. They can come into your home and demand that you produce documentation for every number you report on your tax return. That's why you need all those receipts and records I was telling you about. They can inspect all your financial records and make you account for every transaction. They can seize those records if they want to, and can even take your computer if you keep your records electronically. Then, if they're not satisfied with your explanations, they can arbitrarily declare that you owe more tax. At that point, they can seize your bank account, garnish your wages, even take your house, all without you even being charged with any kind of wrongdoing, much less being convicted of anything. They can even make you testify against yourself under oath.
Mr. Jefferson is visibly stunned. The idea of having to divulge sensitive personal financial information to the government is bad enough, but a federal agency with that kind of power was simply unimaginable.
But wait a minute. You have rights. The Constitution protects you from that kind of tyrannical government. You're guaranteed due process. You're protected from unreasonable search and seizure. You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. It's all right there in the Bill of Rights.
Welcome to the 21st century, my friend. None of that stuff applies when it comes to the IRS. They pretty much do what they want to, and they get away with it.
Mr. Jefferson feels like he's been hit with a sledgehammer. For a few moments, he's rendered utterly speechless. Sadly shaking his head, he begins to realize that the past 200 years have not been so kind to the republic that he and his fellow founding fathers so dearly loved.
Let me try to understand this, sir. People in this country today have to tell the government all about their personal finances. The government helps itself to part of everyone's paycheck before they get it, and then it has the power to swoop in and demand even more without any due process or presumption of innocence. Is that right?
Yep, that's about it in a nutshell.
At this point, Mr. Jefferson collapses into a chair with an ashen look on his face. Cradling his head in his hands, he stares down at the floor. A small tear begins to trickle down his cheek. George just stands there looking at him, suddenly feeling guilty but not knowing what to do.
I can't believe this. This is worse than anything the British ever tried to do to the colonies. We fought a long and bloody revolution against a government far less intrusive and tyrannical than this. Thousands of freedom-loving patriots died so that men might be free from oppressive government. Tell me, George, how did this happen? Surely there must have been some grave financial emergency that required the imposition of such a despotic tax system. Free Americans would never accept something like this unless there was some incredibly dire circumstance.
There was no emergency. There were people in the country who thought it was simply not fair that some people made so much more money than others. The tax was to be used to provide some benefits for poor Americans.
But they can't do that. An income tax is strictly forbidden. Don't your leaders understand history? All of us who worked on the Constitution knew history. We knew that great civilizations began to decline when they introduced direct taxation. We specifically disallowed direct taxation because we knew it would yield the same results that other nations had already experienced. We knew that direct taxation invariably leads to the erosion of individual rights and the oppression of the minority by the majority. Most importantly, direct taxation allows the government to steal at will from its citizens. We knew all that. We knew all that. So we wrote provisions into the Constitution to be sure that that would never happen here. Have today's Americans forgotten history?
I guess we have. As I said, in the early 1900s, there were people pushing for an income tax as a way for the government to provide some benefits to poorer Americans. They promised that it would be just a small tax on a very small number of people. Only the richest of the rich would have to pay it, and they could easily afford it. The people saw no reason to oppose a tax that didn't affect them. In fact, most were actually quite happy to see the government take money from the rich. Economic justice, they called it. So they amended your Constitution. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and that amendment gave the federal government the right to collect an income tax. I guess no one imagined how big, how cumbersome, and how intrusive it would become.
Those fools. How could they have been so blind to history? How could they not see what an income tax would become and what it would do to the people?
Yeah, they sure made a mess. Not only has the income tax grown into a horrible monstrosity that no one understands, the country is now $18 trillion in debt. And it's getting worse by the day, and there's no end in sight.
$18 trillion in debt? How did that happen? I remember exactly what I said back in 1789. I told everyone who would listen that I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the general principles of the Constitution. I mean, an additional article taking from the federal government the power of borrowing. Everyone laughed at me. They said that debts would only be incurred in a time of war or emergency because everyone knew a national debt would be destructive. In my second inaugural address, I warned everyone that we must meet all of the expenses each year without encroaching on the rights of future generations. We must not burden our posterity with debts of the past. We've seen the devastating effects of carrying a national debt. What are you people thinking?
Again, George hangs his head in shame. He's keenly aware of Jefferson's probing eyes looking up at him, pleading for some kind of sane answer, and George simply doesn't have one. By now, he can no longer stand to even look his visitor in the eye. Staring straight down and shifting about nervously, George offers a meager excuse.
I guess everyone got so busy with their own lives, they just quit paying attention to what the government was doing. Of course, this didn't happen all at once. It was phased in little by little over time. There were a few people who did notice what was happening and tried to sound a warning, but they were largely dismissed as kooks and alarmists. Looks like they were right. If only we had just paid more attention.
And this is what we risked our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for. We thought we were giving future generations a free country, governed by the people and for the people. What you have done is taken our idea and twisted it beyond recognition. You have freely submitted to a despotism much worse than anything we ever faced. You may think you're free, but that's because you choose not to see the chains and the walls that imprison you. And my friend, you do live in a prison. You have allowed the government into the most private places of your personal lives. In essence, you work for the government, not for yourselves. Your ancestors would not know you. I'm sorry for my country, and I'm sorry for you. Good night.
With that, Mr. Jefferson slowly gets up, ambles across the room, and walks dejectedly out the front door. As George watches the tall figure disappear into the mist, he feels a despairing sadness like none other he has ever felt before. He knows that Jefferson was right. He knows that what happened is exactly what Thomas Paine predicted, that Americans would not lose their freedoms all at once. Instead, those precious liberties would be slowly eroded away bit by bit, and that no one would really notice what was happening to them until it was too late. So now the question becomes, is it really too late? Has the erosion of our individual liberties really gone past the point of no return? Is the Internal Revenue Service so firmly entrenched in every nook and cranny of our lives that it's impossible to rid ourselves of its malevolent grasp? My fellow patriots, the choice is yours.
Oh, I tell you what, I really enjoy. I could listen to that over and over again. That is real radio theater of the mind.
I have listened to it over and over again, and I still enjoy it. It's great.
Our thanks to Chip Morris and Mel Turner for helping us out with the
with the voices there.
Yeah,
And, of
I
course,
want
to
to remind
Steve for the
people.
idea that it all's based on.
I want to remind people, not only did Steve and Charles Adams write the original score, but when I gave a copy of that short story to Bob several years ago, he said, "Oh, I'm going to write a radio play based on that story." And he did a great job. And we got some good people to help us. So I'm so thankful. The other thing that I was very impressed with when Bob called up Steve and asked him, well, what were you thinking of when you wrote this Jefferson story? And the story behind Jefferson leaving office after 2 terms as president and knowing that the federal government was not involved in everybody's life. I mean, that you would have to travel far and wide to see any evidence of the federal government. That was over 200 years ago. What is it like now? Can you think of any aspect of our lives that the federal government is not involved in?
Not really.
No.
They're into anything and everything.
Yeah, and especially the income tax. So, yeah, we do this because to point this out that the income tax is just the way it's grown, all right, into that Congress uses it as a tool to kind of dominate our lives.
Yeah,
really.
I think Jefferson would be absolutely horrified at the power that the Internal Revenue Service has over our lives and the way that they can go about doing their business without any regard for the constitutional principles of,
Yeah, and that's because Congress has allowed them to do that. And in that skit, you heard what President Jefferson thought of it at the end of it there, just before he left. He was not happy, was he?
Yeah, no. With the IRS, you are not given the presumption of innocence. You are not protected from unreasonable search and seizure.
Yep.
We've been through this many times here on FAIRtax Power Radio, and we're going to keep pounding on it because it continues to be the truth, and we've got to change that. That the IRS is a criminal enterprise. It needs to go away, and the only way that you're going to get the IRS to go away is to get rid of the income tax that it is charged with administering and enforcing. You're never going to turn it into this little warm and fuzzy creature like some of the swamp folks are trying to tell us they're going to do with this new tax reform. Get rid of it. And the only way to get rid of it is to get rid of the income tax. And the only way to get rid of the income tax is to pass the fair tax and repeal the 16th Amendment.
Yeah, get rid of all the horrible complexity of the income tax and the abusiveness of the IRS. Put in something that's very simple and yet very powerful, and that's the fair tax, which is the consumption tax.
That's what we're working on. We'd like to hear from you at the FAIRtaxGuys@gmail.com. Our email address, again, FAIRtaxGuys@gmail.com. We've got a Facebook page. There are several pages on Facebook dedicated to the fair tax, but we have a specific one, the FAIRtax Guys, where you can talk directly to us. We can listen to our Facebook Lives, watch some of the video that we've done of previous Facebook Live events. Those were pretty fun. We had a lot of fun with that last night.
Yeah,
and real quick, last night we were checking on Congress.gov how many proposed changes to the tax code this Congress has made. It is over 1,100 now, 1,102, I believe it was as of last night. And so the lobbyists continue to throw the campaign cash around. The Congress critters continue to make all these monkeying changes with the tax code, and they get away with it because most people aren't looking, but we are, and we're going to call them on it.
Yeah, and we need your help, folks. We need your help to get the fair tax across the finish line. So please do what you can to help. Join the Americans for Fair Taxation at either fairtax.org or bigsolution.org. And join your state organization, too. Most of our states have a state version of the fair tax. So join them, contribute, and get it done.
All right, and that's going to wrap it up for this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Bolero.
Again, the FAIRtax Guys reminding you that the fair tax is America's big solution, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
Fair tax is coming, don't stand in the way. Fair tax is coming, 'cause the